Hello, for coming to my video. I'll briefly explain what gap analysis is. So under gap analysis, we are focusing on the balance sheet of the company. Precisely, we're talking of a bank. So this video is very helpful to those doing banking and finance, precisely international banking as a course. So there's this component of this, gap analysis where you're expected to deal with this table. So this video can help you answering the question under this table. So gap analysis basically helps you to understand the kind of assets in your balance sheet that are influenced by changes in interest rate and the kind of liabilities that are influenced by changes in interest rate. Okay, so you need to understand how to clarify rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive assets, and also non-rate sensitive liabilities and non-rate sensitive rate sensitive liabilities. I beg your pardon. So when you look at your table, you're expected to know why it's RSA and why it's NRSA. But here's a tip. How do you know? Let's focus on the asset side for now. RSA standing for rate sensitive asset. Rate sensitive asset meaning that this asset, the interest rate on the asset varies. In other words, it changes, it's not fixed, meaning that it's influenced by whatever factors we haven't specified in here. Regardless, the asset or the interest that you make on the asset you have been influenced. If it's not fixed, it changes, then it's RSA. So in our table, we are regarding short-term securities or short-term assets to be RSA. Anything that's short-term, that's a very important tip. Anything that's short-term and anything that's variable, it's RSA. So when you look at your table, you realize what I've just said. But for some people, you might be wondering, vote cash, the money that banks keep in their votes, why is it non-rate sensitive assets? Here's a reason. The money that you keep in your vote doesn't generate any kind of interest. It's just kept. In other words, it's not invested in any way, so you're not earning anything from it. So it's non-rate sensitive asset. Long-term loans, non-rate sensitive assets, other assets. So here basically you are going to focus on short-term kind of investments. Your investments can be done when you invest in loans or any kind of securities. As long as they are short-term, we're going to regard them as RSA, rate sensitive assets. On the other side, we are also focusing on short-term liabilities. Short-term liabilities, okay? So anything that's not short-term, we are not using that. So we have got demand deposits. You have to disregard that. Now accounts, disregard that. So here is another tip. When you look at short-term liabilities, remember there's a topic where you did short-term instruments. Short-term, the instruments that people use to raise money, right? When you come up with these instruments, then you go to the public to say you'd like them to invest in your company. They give you the money. That's a strategy of raising funds. But those instruments, remember short-term instruments, we had things like treasury bills, short-term instruments that the government uses to raise funds from the public, right? So it's a good example of RSL, rate sensitive liability, because anything that's short-term will be RSL. Anything that's long-term, non-rate sensitive liability. So money market instruments, shan, you go with those. So that's another tip on the liability side. So the three formulas that you need to be familiar with. The first formula, you need to find the gap analysis itself, which is equals to RSA minus RSL. In simple terms, you're basically finding the difference between your rate sensitive assets and your rate sensitive liability. So you have to get a total of RSAs on this side. You sum them up, and your RSLs, you sum them up, you get the difference. That gives you your gap analysis. That's your first formula. You are done. Really, just like that. Here, definition of the gap, RSA minus RSL. So the difference. So now you get your numbers in your table. For example, short-term securities, I'll get a 15 plus 40 under variable rate loans, 40 plus short-term loans. I'm only getting those three values. The reason is, I said anything that's short-term, anything that's variable, we're using that, disregarding the rest. So when you sum them up, you're going to have a 75. When you go on your liability side, we'll get, disregarding the now accounts, demand deposits, money market, RSL 20 plus short-term savings 40 plus treasury fund borrowings. You sum them up, you have a 115. So when you do 75 minus 115, you're going to have, by the way, you are not going to disregard the symbol. If you have a negative value, you have to show it. So that's your first formula. Gap, RSA minus RSL. Very simple. Then we've got relative gap ratio. So the relative gap ratio, when you find your first answer, your gap over your total assets. So here, we are not trying to be picky. We are not really precise. Yeah, we haven't categorized the kind of assets that you need to go with when on your total assets. But instead, regardless of the status of the asset, whether being RSA or NRSA, you get the summation of the assets. So in our case, when you add all the numbers, that's why you have a 195. So relative gap ratio is basically the gap. The first answer you find. How do you find the first answer? The difference between your assets that are sensitive to the interest rate and the difference between these two. That's your gap over total assets. Total assets, you sum up the total assets that you have. You have your relative gap ratio, of which here's a fact. Once you have your gap that's negative, automatically you're going to have your relative gap ratio that's negative, of which you are going to have your interest rate sensitive ratio that's less than 1. Interest rate sensitive ratio that's less than 1. So 3 formulas: gap, RSA minus RSL. Second, relative gap ratio, the answer that you find over your total assets. Then the last one, interest rate sensitive ratio. You are just dealing again with RSA and RSL, except this time you are dividing. In the first place, you subtracted. Interest rate sensitive ratio, you divide. So since we found 75, when you sum this up, you get your 75. On the other side, you get your 115. You find the difference. You found a negative 40. This time, you just do 75 divided by 115. That's your interest rate sensitive ratio, which should be less than 1. Why? Because we have the gap that's negative, causing the relative gap ratio to be negative because the top value is going to be negative. So that's how you do your calculations. That's how you do your formulas. Thanks for your time. It's been your boyish with a voice. Have a pleasant day.